on this episode of Clear the Air.
What do you think drives accountability then in an organization?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, as someone running a company, you know, if someone came in and said, hey, here's an option and it would save us some money, but it's going to kill a bunch of people, I'd just say no.
I think there's also another component in there that holds companies a little bit more accountable, and that is that if our product is junk and it's not fulfilling the promise, then ultimately people won't buy it and will go away. And I think it's fascinating that there is almost this approach in the government where the results are inconsequential.
I think it's imperative that our Congress, that they come up with some way to hold government employees at least somewhat responsible for the horrendous decisions that they make, because if they don't, then... Welcome to Clear the Air podcast. I'm Nathan Jones, and I'm here today with Shad Slaughter.
Hey, everyone. Glad to have you back, Nate.
Well, what do you mean have me back?
You were gone for a couple episodes.
Oh, yeah. I was rafting down the Colorado River with my children. But today we're going to talk about accountability. And there's been a lot of stuff in the news lately about Boeing. They were in the news a couple weeks ago, and them accepting a criminal deal for something. I mean, it's just crazy. And I read through it and I said, this is crazy. But you have all kinds of stuff, like even today, the director of the Secret Service resigned, Cheadle, even though she didn't want to, because she didn't acknowledge that there was any responsibility or any accountability for any of what happened that she was accountable for. And we have this problem. I think we have a problem in our society where we just aren't taught how to be accountable, that we're not taught self-responsibility. And it's something that we have to address.
Yeah, it's interesting with the stuff that was happening over actually the last few years with Boeing, with the MAX planes going down, and now with some of the doors, I guess, coming off of the airplane. And you being a pilot, I was curious, you know, how that affects your view of it. I know as a passenger, I have a limited understanding of what flight is like, but as a pilot, is there any kind of insight into that makes it more interesting?
I don't sit by the door.
You get to look forward.
Yeah, you know, again, that goes back to accountability, and I've paid attention to that. And I mean, really, what it is just everybody passing the buck. You read some of these things, and I have a couple of weeks ago I read in a bunch of this stuff about it. And really what it is it's just Boeing's management style has been one where nobody's accountable. And so, I mean, they had, when their 737 MAX was crashing, you know, they just weren't accountable. Nobody was ever accountable for the flaws in the design and the software that it took to fly the airplane. And I mean, my personal opinion is you should never get into an airplane that is 100% reliable on software to fly it. I understand, you know, these big airplanes and even the little airplanes. Once you get up, you know, I mean, literally, I mean, I'm not kidding. 20 feet off the ground, 30 feet off the ground, you flip the autopilot and it's all programmed in and the plane follows it. But you shouldn't have one where if the computer crashes, that you can't go down and land it. And there's a lot of systems out there that happen. And with the 737 MAX, if I remember right, that was what the problem was there was a software glitch that the pilots would be thinking, they'd be pulling back and they'd be fighting against the system trying to do it. And it's simply because there was a software glitch.
Well, they pushed the engines forward on the airplane, which changed its center of balance. But then they didn't update the software and give training.
Actually, I should clarify that. It's not the center of balance. It's the center of gravity.
The center of gravity. And then, but they didn't, they just passed it along as though it was still a 737. And from my understanding, they didn't do software upgrades and they didn't do training for the pilots. And so what was happening is that difference in the way the plane was flying was being read by the software differently than what the pilots were experiencing. And they were fighting against that software.
Correct.
So,
and that's just that's just somebody somewhere had to have made the decision to do that. And I think you know, big companies, you know, they tend to have issues like that. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of huge companies because I do think that a lot of accountability gets lost in that.
What do you think drives accountability then in an organization? So, or sorry, let me rephrase that. What do you think keeps people from being accountable? What are the pressures that maybe Boeing was facing that caused them to do, what I guess are shortcuts or not even following their own SOPs?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, as someone running a company, if someone came in and said, hey, here's an option and it would save us some money, but it's going to kill a bunch of people, I'd just say no.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, that's kind of a no-brainer. You can go back and look at, I believe it was Vioxx, when they put Vioxx on the market, Merck, I think it was Merck, but they actually, they have documents now showing that they made a conscious decision, said, hey, you know what, we're gonna put this drug out there. We know there's gonna be a bunch of people that are gonna die from it, but we're gonna make enough money that we can pay, whatever the right. cost is to defend that. And to me, again, that's the company isn't the one that made the decision. The executives did. The people that are involved did.
That's a good point. So, like, the obvious pressure is a financial pressure, but do you think that is magnified by people within the organization being indemnified from personal decisions that led to that by lumping it into just a big corporate decision?
I do think. I think that when people in any organization, and especially governmental organizations, are indemnified when they make bad decisions and even immoral decisions, I think that's where a lot of stuff. I mean, I think that's why, that's why we had the opioid crisis. I think that's why the Vioxx happened. I think that's the whole reason why we had the whole COVID pandemic. I mean, if the people running public health had to answer personally, I don't think that Fauci would have come out and said, yeah, do this, do that. No, don't do this. I think he would have been a lot more deliberate. But he learned his lesson back when he was managing the AIDS crisis, that he had no accountability. He could say whatever he wanted, and then nobody could do anything.
And if everything went south, it was an agency issue, not an individual issue.
Agency issue, yeah.
Is that kind of what we're seeing, I guess, with the plea at Boeing? I mean, I don't know if any criminal charges have been put against.
I think there have been criminal charges. And again, how does a corporation commit a crime? I don't think a corporation is capable of committing a crime. I mean, how does a corporation, kill someone?
So, just to be clear, you're not saying that there shouldn't be any accountability for when issues happen. It's just that it's more complex than the corporation being accountable. It's the people within the corporation?
Correct. I think there's so many complexities to it that it's a hard thing. And the easy cop-out answer is, well, let's just make no one accountable. I mean, that's what our government has done.
Right.
And we should address that and try to find a way that works, that holds people more personally accountable for decisions they make that affect people on a much broader scale in corporations and in government.
I know that you've been really close to the government's response on COVID, both from, a business owner and, potentially having a therapy that could help, and then also now being, a lawsuit from a government agency. Like, how do you see things different had there been individual accountability on the COVID response versus just agency accountability? Or not even agency accountability at this point, I don't think.
Yeah. There's zero. I don't even think anybody has accountability for what happened during COVID. And the thing is that understanding the way our government is and the bureaucrats in the government, nobody will ever have accountability. Fauci knows he will never see a court. He knows that. It won't happen. I mean, none of these bureaucrats will, because they have, I can't remember what the name of it is, but it's a term, and they're immune from prosecution for anything, as long as they can very loosely say, well, I did it while I was working. Well,
so
you can make all the wrong decisions you want, and they're still,
right.
Decisions you made. But there's no accountability, and so they don't even care to make the right decisions.
Like, the very worst that could happen is an uncomfortable sit down with a congressional hearing and potentially have calls for resignation, but doesn't seem like much after that.
Correct. And I don't know the ins and outs of it. What I do know from Cheadle and the Secret Service, I mean, because that's much more, that's last week. And it was yesterday that she finally announced that she was resigning. She acknowledged that the attempted assassination on Trump was the worst breakdown in Secret Service in the agency in decades. you would think that she would have just said, I screwed up. Sorry, I screwed up. My agency screwed up. I'm the head of the agency. I quit. And she actually had to take a lot of heat from Congress and from the public and from everybody else before she finally said, maybe I should quit.
Do you think, which is interesting because I think that, it's really easy to quickly go after someone and say, you screwed up, you should lose your job, and you should, you aren't capable of it. Do you think that we're missing a piece of the accountability there where the correct action is, I screwed up and I need to be here to help fix it, whether that's in the current position or whether there's some oversight, but I can't just, I'm resigning, wash my hands of it and go off. I've got to participate in the solution.
As long as they acknowledge that that's the case, then yeah. But the problem is that, if you listen to what she was saying, she doesn't accept any accountability for it. If you can't accept accountability, a friend of mine, a doctor who was who grew up in Cuba, he once told me something that I thought was really interesting, and he used the word corruption, but I'll just say, you can use that as an example, but because it applies to a lot of things, that you have to acknowledge that you're not doing a good job before you can actually fix that you're not doing a good job. Okay, and we in the United States, we don't acknowledge that much that our government is that corrupt. Because, we don't want to acknowledge it as corrupt. But if we don't acknowledge that there's corruption,
can't fix it.
We can't address it and fix it. And he pointed out to me when we were having this discussion, this is 7 or 8, 9 years ago, that every human organization, every organization set up by man, every single one of them has corruption in it. The question is whether or not we are willing to admit the corruption, and whether, in order to improve that organization, we do have to admit there is corruption.
How much do you think, kind of going back to that, like sticking around to fix it or admitting that you failed at something, do you think that that's getting increasingly difficult for someone to do, given the speed of the court of public opinion, right? With like headline news and social media, and someone comes out and says, hey, we did an audit of our organization and we're failing in these areas. And this is what we're going to do to fix it. It seems like the headline would be CEO admits that their company is failing and shareholders demand their exit. So you can't even acknowledge that you're not doing something right in order to fix it at this point.
It's a fine line. That's, that's one of the trickiness and why, these people are in the positions they are, because they've got to learn how to do that. Right. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not saying it's easy.
Sure. And I'm sure there's lots of good examples of organizations that are led by executives that feel that way. They take personal responsibility, whether there's, legal accountability actually assigned to it, but just as a way of doing their job. Yeah.
And I think that more companies need to have that personal accountability tied to what they're doing.
It'd be interesting to know. I'm not sure. There's a new executive new CEO at Boeing, and she candidly came out yesterday or 2 days ago and said, "Hey, it's probably going to take a decade to kind of fix some of the issues within the organization." I'm guessing that the exiting CEO had a pretty decent exit package as he left.
That to me is a crime. That is a horrible.
Why so? How so?
Because I don't know what the exiting package was, but you have an exiting CEO that's probably going to make, let's say tens of millions, if not more, in their golden parachute as they exit. And the person that's overseeing the organization or the organization where the people that committed the crime were, is getting probably a bigger payout than any of the people that were killed. And to me, that's a horrible thing. I mean, if someone's leaving a company because it was committing crimes, there were people in there that were committing crimes and the organization was allowing it, those people shouldn't be getting these big golden parachutes.
And compounded by the fact that you had people within the organization that were trying to do the right thing, and, whistleblowers, and two of those whistleblowers ended up, losing their lives. And, I think that the probably the most generous reading of that is that the pressure of what they were going through, led to their early demise. There are less generous ways of reading that.
Do you think they were suicided or committed suicide.
I don't have enough information to say either way, but I think that regardless if it was self-inflicted or if it was imposed, it was pressure from the organization that shouldn't have been on people that were trying to do the right thing.
I agree with. I mean, the people inside the organization, inside the Boeing organization, I think there is some fault on them for those two, whether they were directly ordered to be suicided or the pressure that came from them that drove them to commit suicide. Either way, I think that Boeing should have both of those whistleblowers were trying to help Boeing get back on the right track, and the organization of Boeing was putting pressure on them not to.
Yeah, I personally think one of the things that leads organizations down the path of, or people within an organization down the path of unethical decisions or risky decision behaviors that have negative consequences towards their consumers is they start to focus on the profit side of the business and don't recognize that profits are just a measurement of how effectively you're creating value, right? And so if an organization is focusing on the value that they're creating, not necessarily for the shareholders, I mean, it's certainly part of the stakeholder view, but the users, what is the value that we're creating for the users? And you measure how much value you're creating by the users by your profitability, right? Because the user ultimately depends how valuable your product is in the marketplace. Then that seems to be kind of a safer North Star when you're focused on the experience and use of the consumer. If you start to look at that measurement of profits as the North Star and drive everything towards that, then I think you start compromising on that relationship with that end user or the consumer.
Yeah.
So
I agree.
More of a statement than a question, I guess. But
well, that was a long question. It was a question, and the question got lost way in the beginning. It ended up being a statement.
Yeah.
You know, while you were telling me that statement rather than a question, it actually reminded me of something. You know, I've been driving a BMW car for 25 years. And the second one I bought, they had a program called the European Delivery, and I went over to Germany to Munich, and, you tour the factory, and it was an amazing experience. They quit it during COVID, and BMW, bring it back. Please bring it back. They haven't brought it back yet, so I'm not buying any more until they do. But
I think you can get a Volvo that way.
Yeah, Mercedes had it, Volvo, a lot of them had it. But one of the things that I really when I went over there, the first thing that when you're touring the thing, you go through this museum, and BMW, they had actually put their money where their mouth is, and I don't know if I've ever told you this story, but you go through this museum and they're talking about it, and they had this thing where they pointed out and they said, during World War II, we were using slaves from the concentration camps for labor. That's a stain on our company reputation. And we're doing everything we can to try to wash that stain away. It will never be washed away, but we're going to do what we can. And I believe it was the first, don't quote me on this, but one of the first facilities that they built outside of Germany was in South Africa. And they deliberately, this is what they told me, maybe if I'm remembering wrong, and one of the reasons they chose to do that is it was during the years of apartheid. And they went down to South Africa and they built it there in South Africa, and they had the stipulation that the workforce was integrated. And so that was one of the first major factories, if not the first major factory in South Africa, driving that integration and ending apartheid. And I thought that was great because they're doing what they can to fix the social ills that were in the world at that time. And part of what that is they were trying to, I don't want to say atone, but they were trying to make right something that they acknowledged was a moral stain on their company.
And and going back to this, whether corporations, are liable or whether people in corporations, I guess that would be the same thing. It's like that's a plod to the executive team and the management team that decided that was important and developed that as part of the culture to BMW.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's all part of it.
Yeah. So how do you think? I mean, that becomes really challenging, right? To say, well, it's not the corporation; it's the people within the corporation. What would have to change to be able to follow that through to actually have more accountability within an organization?
I don't know. That's a huge thing. I think it comes from the top leadership. And so we have to be accountable ourselves. Hopefully I'm accountable for some of the decisions I make here. I think I am. I don't know that I'm throwing anybody else under the bus for bad decisions. I think I've made many decisions where things cost more, but it made a better product. And if we have something, I don't know that we've ever sold something that hurt anybody, because by the time, so I don't know how to answer that question.
I can say that having worked with you, that in our conversations, there always is that consideration of, are we keeping that commitment of making people's lives better and reducing overall healthcare costs by, preventative action versus, reactive action. So I think I've experienced it, and it's been nice working with you and understanding that, there is a responsibility for the executive team to be focusing on what is the value that's being created for the customer, not just what is the financial return that we're seeing from our actions.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think everybody does. I mean, so let me finish this. I think that the whole part and parcel of what we've been discussing is not an easy conversation to have. I don't know how. There's never going to be a definitive line of this is where it is, and this is this is a company and this is that, because you can't. It's there's many shades of gray in there. But I think that companies, and I think that this goes back to even parents. Parents should teach their kids how to be accountable and be responsible for their own actions. But it's a hard question. I know that we're not going to come up with an answer here today. But I do think that it is something that we have to address. I think that our Congress, I think it's imperative that our Congress, in Washington D.C., that they come up with some way to hold government employees at least somewhat responsible for the horrendous decisions that they make. Because if they don't, then we see where our country's going. I don't think there's any issues. But you see, without any responsibility, I'll use this as an example because it's one that I know personally, that people in the government knew, and I've shared this before, knew in early 2020 that just using the saltwater irrigation made COVID nearly 100% non-lethal. There were people in the government, in the FTC, who knowingly ignored and suppressed that data and sent warning letters out to stop people from sharing that data. And that caused our country to spend literally trillions, not billions, trillions of dollars that didn't have to be spent. And it cost millions of people their life. They're never going to be held accountable. I mean, I could give you 3 names of people in the FTC who would be personally accountable, because they even acknowledge that when people sent them, like us, when we sent them studies, they didn't even read them. That is complete dereliction of duty. They will never be held responsible. And unless our government can find a way...
Sorry, I was trying to hold that in for so long.
and unless our government can actually find a way to, at some level, hold these people, hold their employees, the bureaucrats, their employees, responsible, they're never going to fix the problem. We as a company, we have to hold our employees responsible, or we get sued, we have issues. The government doesn't have that, so they don't care.
I think there's also another component in there that holds companies a little bit more accountable, and that is that ultimately we're only successful if our consumers agree with us, right? And make a purchase decision.
Yeah.
Right?
The
And it's
doesn't
like,
care.
if our product is junk and it's not fulfilling the promise, then ultimately people won't buy it and will go away. And I think it's fascinating that there is almost this approach in the government where the results are inconsequential, right? It's what is the idea, and are we spending towards what we think ought to be the results, and the results don't matter. And if you look at that, so many of the programs that we spend against from a government standpoint, the results have not improved. The spending has increased. The amount of effort has increased.
I think a great example with that is healthcare. I mean, you can go back for 40 years, 50 years, and look at healthcare, and our expenditures have increased exponentially almost. Incredible. I don't know it off the top of my head, but I do know that for the longest time, we were in more or less the same area where about 8 to 10% of our GDP was spent on healthcare. And then all of a sudden it just blew up. I mean, I know when that happened. It happened when they made Obamacare. They told us it would drive the cost down, but really what it did is it doubled the cost over the last 10 years. I mean, that's not my opinion. That's actually just fact. Our healthcare costs in the United States are now 18.5 or 19% of our GDP, and 15 years ago they were 10%. And so, without being able and having people in the healthcare system being held accountable, nobody cares. Let's just spend more money, throw more money.
The reaction is we're putting in the hours, we're putting in the time. It's unfortunate the results aren't happening, but we're doing our job.
Yeah, throwing in the money. But, whether or not you get results, we're still throwing in money. And we're still going to throw in more money because we're not getting results.
It's fascinating you bring that up. I listened to a debate recently, and I can't remember the names off the top of my head. We'll have to, post them if we find it relevant. But the one person had gone through and said, look, there's only one other time in history that a highly developed nation saw a decline in its life expectancy. So the U.S. right now is facing a decline in life expectancy. He said the only other time that's ever happened that he's been able to find is the fall of the USSR. Towards the end of the USSR, life expectancy was starting to decrease at a rapid rate, and they were, as a developed nation, they saw that, and he postulated that we were going the route of the Soviet Union. The person debating said there are other reasons that we weren't. Anyway, that part's irrelevant. But yeah,
well, that's interesting.
We invest so much money and so much technology and so many resources into healthcare, and yet the result, we're getting a negative result.
We're getting fat. It's a very interesting topic, but how do we get people to be more accountable? I mean, I'd like to challenge, people to be more accountable in their own lives. I'd like them to encourage their children to be more accountable, their employees, their staff, their business partners, even the other bureaucrats in your office. I know the FTC listens to everything we say. But take some accountability for what you're doing and for the people that are being harmed, and try to mitigate that. I guess that's another episode of Clear the Air.
This episode was hosted by Nathan Jones, co-hosted by Shad Slaughter, produced by David Monk, associate producer Matthew Davis. Video and audio were edited by Caleb Scoresby, research by Sabre Bills, graphics by Joseph Thornton, music by Augusto Diniz. If you enjoyed this episode of Clear the Air, be sure to follow, like, and subscribe so you don't miss out on the latest episode. Have a favorite episode? Share it with a friend or on social media. New episodes of Clear the Air are published weekly on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.